ITN first clocked in back in 1955, and it brought a new kind of job to television, personalities to present the news. Far more people then still preferred to take their news from the wireless or the newspaper.
Reggie? Never mind tonight. It should be right, shouldn't it? Yeah.
Today, TV news on all channels has grown into the main source of information for 2/3 of the nation. And the struggle to make news good box office is ITN's story.
Where does the VCR begin? There.
An earpiece means the control room talks directly to the newscaster, even while he's on the air. So if there's a change in the news, he's the first to hear.
Right, listen, facilities, what have we got to rehearse?
It's TV's equivalent of clear the front page, something that newspapers nowadays can't do as quickly as television news.
Anyway, the Lebanon's gone and all those captions, yes, all out.
Well, anyway, let's go, boys. I can't wait anymore.
The British curate and the woman courier who were jailed in Yugoslavia
Right,
after an
coming
incident
to
in which
2
two
and 4.
policemen were hurt are expected to come home
Take 2
in a
and
couple
4
of
and cue
days' time.
Reggie.
Chancellor of the Exchequer, Mr. Healy, has told trade unions that they'll have to restrict pay claims. Like its BBC rival, News at 10 tries consciously to provide the basic essentials of tomorrow's newspaper.
Right, cue Andrew for story 10. Could somebody take this in? Could you give it to Jeff, please? Thank you.
It's David English, who's the editor of the Mail.
Thank you. Was the usual bluster of a politician caught with his pants down. The Daily Mail had documents to prove the
In a half-hour
story.
news on television, there's time to speak no more than 3,000 words, far fewer than there are on the front page of the Times. Yet TV news has forced newspapers to rethink, even contract their news coverage.
In fact, fans, let's pull tell us at our... Oh, we'll have to put that bloody map on chroma key. Jeff, oh, that's cut that bit anyway.
He was still going to stop out the loophole. That, said Mr. English, speaks for itself. Yes, that's fine. Okay.
Deeply worried by story 4A, which has just got nothing new in it at all.
Let us just get on with what we've got now.
2 minutes of transmission, 2 minutes.
Has somebody told Julian he is story 1?
Right, cue Andrew.
Government have announced their final proposal.
TV news on all 3 channels has increased 6 times since 1955. News is often in the ratings. Yet in the early days, ITN had to battle endlessly to save its programs from being trimmed.
The Scottish Assembly brings forward a bill which goes beyond its devolved powers. Good evening, Julian. The previous plan was for such decision to be made by the Secretary of State for Scotland.
45 seconds of transmission.
Right, stand by Telecine 3, VTR 3, Telecine 4, Telecine 2, Telecine 1, camera 1. And camera 3 on the monitor.
30 seconds of transmission, 30 seconds.
Friends.
25. 20 to transmission. 15, 14, 13, 12.
Roll Telecine 3.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, out. Roll VTR 3. 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3.
Our story begins with the countdown to the very first broadcast in September 1955.
What the hell is that on to?
I walked into the newsroom of ITN, as it was called, with just a few tables, nothing going on, in August 1955, and a very attractive red-haired lady called Diana Edwards-Jones came up to me and said, a Welsh lady, and she said, "Who the hell are you?" And I said, "I'm a newscaster," and she said, "God almighty, can't they do better than that?" It was a very informal atmosphere. The cameraman used to rush out and get film of what, a fire or a disaster or something. And then Chris Chataway and myself used to do a dummy newscast to a wooden simulated camera.
I don't think we had a single rehearsal with a telecine, a single rehearsal with proper monitors and so on. And we had a little projector, 16mm projector, and we had a blackboard to write up cues and captions, and we had a gramophone record for sort of off music and so on. It was rather a total Heath Robinson thing. It did look as if we weren't going to get on the air. And in fact, I think I'm right, the last piece of machinery, it may have been the telecines themselves, were only put in 2 hours before ITN opened, 2 hours before the first newscast.
I was the newscaster on the first night. I was then still deeply involved in athletics and used to the excitement of running in races and butterflies tearing all over my stomach. And I think that the first night of ITN was rather the same.
For these occasions? Yes, for these occasions. You often get big crowds here watching? Yes, always big crowds here. What about tonight? Well, I should imagine everybody's at home, hoping for the best and waiting to see this new ITN television. You think we're all at home watching now? I should imagine they are.
About 3 nights after we'd gone on there, we were still in a state of chaos. And I remember one of the directors was shouting to the back projection operator in the studio, and he wouldn't answer. And the director was getting more and more angry and saying, "Can you hear me? Can you hear me?" And as Chris was reading something terribly serious, this great hairy head appeared just over his shoulder, going, "Yes, yes, I can hear you." And then another time, Robin ran out of news, and he just picked up the newspaper and started reading from the newspaper. And the controller was saying, "He's reading out of the newspaper." And there was quite a big row after that little episode.
Welcome to Channel 9. We
Dubbing data ready. Stand by, Grams.
So over first of all now to the ITN studio, and your newscaster tonight is Christopher Chataway.
Q Grams. Cameron 1. Stand by to Q Chris. Coming to 2. Q Chris. Sector.
Good evening. The government is not going to grant automatic reprieves to convicted murderers. It is going to find time, probably in about 3 weeks, for the second reading of...
Well, one really felt that one was doing something tremendously important because there wasn't any television news in Britain at the time. All that there was on the BBC was an extension of radio. There was somebody there who intoned the news rather like a psalm, as if it had been read by somebody else. And then there was a newsreel, you know, the Queen Mother visited a flying boat today, and that sort of sing-song voice that you get on the newsreels on in the cinema. So there really wasn't any television news, and we felt that we were starting something absolutely brand new.
There was laughter in the House of Commons when Mr. Geoffrey de Freitas questioned the Home Secretary about Alfred George Hines, the escaped prisoner whose voice was heard on London Independent television. Mr. de Freitas asked Major Lloyd George if he held out no hope of the police catching Hines unless he made a personal appearance on TV.
Robin and I thought that we had been hired by the editor on the basis that we would, subject only to his authority, have control over what we said. That wasn't really accepted by a good many of the people who had been hired from Fleet Street, experienced journalists, to produce the copy. They saw our role as roughly akin to that of the printer in Fleet Street. And I remember one gnarled old Scotsman who came from the Daily Express saying, "Copy is sacred." And when I altered what he'd written, you know, he regarded that as rather like the printer in Fleet Street taking it into his own hands to alter what the journalist had written. So there was the basis there for a hell of a row, and there were lots of rows.
ITN's advertisement for newscasters said essential qualifications included a sense of humour and a cool head in emergencies. These are screen tests from some of the dozens who thought that they had these qualities. Hopefuls came from 3 main groups.
The actors, some of whom had lovely voices and very good presence, never became part of their delivery. They never cast it in a way that carried any conviction at all. And it's a curious thing. I suppose they were acting. They were still seeing themselves as a newscaster and not actually casting. The journalists were quite good, but much shyer. They were unused to the camera, and very few of them made a good impression for that. But far the best were the lawyers. There was something incisive about them. They saw the point. They were brief, and they, I suppose from practicing the bar. I mean, the fact is they delivered it in far the most dramatic and incisive way. And this was why, for instance, Robin Day, who had legal background, came over so well.
I understand you're the organizer in the market of the Transport and General Workers Union, and this is a matter of public interest. I'd ask you to answer my questions on this matter. Will you tell me why you'll make a statement to the Daily Express and other newspapers and not to my organization? Thank you very much, Mr. Tribe.
When I got inside ITN and looked at the film from behind the screen, as it were, I thought that we had excellent film coverage, which was, in a curious way, often blunted in its news impact. And I realized that this was because action film was covered with a silent camera, and the sound was then either dubbed on artificially, or, but more often the film was backed by music.
A fresh wave of violence in Cyprus. Fire roared through the Greek quarter of Nicosia on Saturday night after a raid by a gang of Turkish Cypriots. Early on Sunday morning, the whole sky over the capital was tinted red by the flames. 2 Greek Cypriots were killed and many others injured. On Monday, the bodies of the 2 dead Greeks had to be given a military escort to the cemetery. Besides the relatives, hundreds of other Greek Cypriots had turned out to join the procession.
After I'd been in ITN, I think about 3 or 4 weeks, we got a piece of film in, shot by CBS, who were then our foreign film suppliers, of a riot in Cyprus. And this had the natural sound on it.
Squad, tear gas bomb. Squad going into action. Tear gas bomb to disperse part of the crowd. Stoning. Troops have rescued the Greek flag, which was carried by the demonstrators. Post.
This seemed to me to be the real use of film to bring through the hard news. And so we set about in ITN experimenting with this, and when we got an opportunity, we used it. And this occurred on a strike in the Austin works at Longbridge. It was, by modern standards, a very peaceful and minor affair. But instead of using a silent picture, the camera crew moved into the middle of this, picked up the natural sound, and it had a remarkable effect. And we were launched on the pattern, which of course is now commonplace, of the actual sound as well as the picture of hard news being recorded for the screen.
When we first started Vox Pops, stopping people in the street, of course, people didn't know who you were. They thought you were either a representative of MI5, or they thought you were from an opinion poll, or they thought you were from the Inland Revenue. And if you said ITN, I mean, they didn't know what ITN was. And the problem was to get somebody to stop. And with the engineering workers, which was one of the first ones I did, I can remember standing outside that gate, and they were pouring out, and they come out pretty fast because they want to get home, they want to get to the pub, and they'd just been paid. And it was 5 minutes before anyone had stopped.
Are you an engineer? No, well then, you mind your own business. I'm trying to get you... Whenever you're an engineer, you can talk to me.
But once one had stopped, an enormous crowd gathered, and they all then wanted to have a go. And they grasped what we were doing.
Take from a week's wage if you took that home to her with 6 children. How much is in there? That's a week's wages. How much is it? 30 days. 30 days on the docket. Would you take that home to a wife and 6 children? £7, 5 and 10. Yes, and that's with a bit of overtime.
everything we did, or much of what we did, seemed to be new, seemed to represent an opportunity to usher in a new kind of journalism which would bring news alive in people's homes in a way that had never been achieved before.
Excuse me, Stuart, you're a representative here. Look, no problem. Listen, the public want to know whether you're going back to work or not. What is your answer?
Next Christmas.
That's your answer, is it?
Next Christmas. Don't want to know.
We've got to go back. We've been betrayed by cousins and the flower. Stooges for the flower mark. Are you going back to work tomorrow? I'm a paper seller. Oh, I see.
I remember the first interview that I was sent out on, a filmed interview, was to do an interview at the airport with Field Marshal Harding. And, of course, the BBC style of interviewing then was to greet people at the bottom of the airport steps and the airplane steps and say, Your Excellency, how do you view the current situation? The aggressive, probing interview was entirely unknown. And Aden Crawley, the editor, wanted to make some changes and innovations there as well. And I remember before I went out to interview Harding, he said to me, well, what are you going to say to him? I said, well, I shall say, well, sir. Well, don't say well, he said, and don't say sir. He was absolutely insistent that there should be some, if not cross-examination, at least some probing, some attempt to get at the truth, even though he wanted people to be courteous as well.
The number of politicians that one has had going out of the studio in those early days saying, but I hadn't even got started. I mean, they were used to 10-minute, 20-minute interviews, and we weren't giving them to them. We were saying, you know, you get it into the first minute or we haven't time to deal with it.
And they also were caught by the 14-day rule. This, though it seems unbelievable now, was a rule under which Parliament had decided that in order to safeguard Parliament as the central forum of political debate, that no subject due to be dealt with in Parliament in the next fortnight could be discussed on the air. And in fact, we had to begin to practice the technique of the probing political interview with foreigners. And one of the striking early instances of it was when Robin Day, who was the great leader of this type of interviewing, interviewed the Japanese foreign minister. And he tackled him at London Airport about a practice which at that time was infuriating people in this country.
Could I show you these two packages? This is a British packet of ball bearings, and this is an almost identical packet of ball bearings made in Japan, a deliberate copy. What do you have to say about that?
I think this is out of order.
Well, what does the Foreign Minister have to say about it? That was my question to the Foreign Minister.
Yes, the Foreign Minister will need time to answer this kind of question. If you have this in mind, you should have given him advance knowledge.
You didn't ask for advance knowledge of any questions whatever.
Of course we don't, because we didn't expect you were so treacherous.
You think this is treachery to show you these packets?
Yes, this courtesy.
I think only the Foreign Office thought it was a bit discourteous, but you'll expect that. The British press wasn't at all critical, and I got lots of letters applauding what I'd done. And I remember going down to the Labour Party conference a week or two later, and an Iron Bevan came up to me in the bar. He said, I see you had a bit of trouble with the Japs, boy. He said, they accused you of treachery. He said, you know what you should have said? You should have said, Pearl Harbor to you, boy, Pearl Harbor to you. And I was rather sorry that my repartee hadn't been strong enough. Oh, no, it was welcomed, and people found it rather refreshing. But the curious thing is that I didn't go there intending to do something clever or sensational. I just went along there with a normal journalistic instinct. And this was the secret of ITN, to bring to broadcasting and television the traditional principles of good journalism.
Duke of Edinburgh gave his first press conference that I know of in this country to which television was allowed when he came back from a trip to America with Lord Watkinson to promote British exports. So I sat down and I said, sir, you've just been all round America. What do the Americans think of this country at the moment? And he said, what a bloody stupid question.
I didn't ask them all. There's 250 million of them.
So I thought, all right, I've bowled you a slow ball. You've hit it out of the ground for 6. I'm not going to bowl you any more. So I then went into the harder stuff, and I said to him, how did you get on with the press?
I got on extremely well with the press. I normally do, I think. But there are certain things occasionally which they do, which perhaps I don't like very much. I think the business of constantly, for instance, which happens in a great many places, this is business of overhearing conversations. I mean, in a way, if you're presented with all these things and all those things, you know more or less that if you're going to say something, it's going to be taken down. But if you're having a conversation and somebody pokes one of these at you with a tape recorder behind, or one of those long listening devices which they can overhear a conversation 20 yards away, you get a bit anxious.
This is what you were specifically objecting.
Well, I don't know what this is about.
Well, there was a quote.
I just object to them on principle.
There was a quote, I think, which appeared on television that you suggested to a chap with one of these things how he might dispose of it during private conversation.
I'm delighted he took it down. I hope he did it.
Non-stop played a very important part in establishing ITN as a different sort of news service. This jaunty, slightly irreverent, pacey tune struck immediately a sense that this was a no-nonsense bulletin, free of pomposity. By the end of 1956, we'd arrived at a pattern for the bulletins which I could describe as ITN Mark I. This was to hit the hard news hard, to cover action news with a natural sound on it, to have probing political interviewing and probing industrial interviewing, and if possible to have one item which sent a chuckle around the whole country every night.
Press cuttings and pictures, Jane, and I read that once you led a tiger down Sunset Boulevard by a pink ribbon. Is that true?
Yes, I like pink.
Have you brought the tiger with you to London?
No, not this time.
I normally thought I was rather a grim and heavy fellow, but in fact I was the first person to inject humour into a newscast. I used to perhaps not invent one, but make something funny out of a story with a comment, or else just make a little joke, a personal joke at the end of the news. The idea being to always end the news with a smile. I remember once ending it by saying good night, particularly to the charming lady from Beckenham or somewhere, who wrote to me saying I was a swollen-headed pipsqueak, and this brought a smile, and it enabled the newscaster to appear as something else than just a human machine reading out routine news stories.
Foreign coverage of television news developed fairly slowly. The main venture that we made into this field ourselves, after covering the port side end of the Suez landing, was to interview Nasser in the summer of 1957. Until then, we had been a small British television service and not known outside of the country.
In his garden, in his house in Cairo, here is President Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt.
The interview marked the start of television's moving into the area of its own foreign coverage and of securing its own scoops in the foreign field.
1 year ago, who nationalized the Suez Canal for Egypt, and events subsequent to that will be within your recollection.
In those early days, television news was itself news, even if, at times, unusual methods were used to take the public behind the scenes to see how bulletins were made. Among other innovations was Britain's first woman newscaster.
Good morning to you. Mr. Macmillan, the Foreign Secretary, left London Airport this morning for Geneva, where the meeting of the 4 foreign ministers resumes today. With him was Mr. Shuck.
The idea was very much that we shouldn't stand back from a story, we should become involved in it if possible. For example, there was one occasion when the news editor decided that I should sit in the nose cone of a warplane when it was being caught in a net. And it was only, I think, that there wasn't a single insurance company that would take it on that stopped me having to do that. But other stories had their problems. I mean, for example, meeting a judo expert.
And the man in the street doesn't normally know how to fall, so you'd be very careful throwing them onto concrete pavements or anything like that, so you normally only use the holds and locks, enough force to take your man in.
Well, I couldn't throw a man over my shoulder.
Oh, yes, quite easily. Would you like to come and try?
All right,
Mr. Koizumi?
All right, I'll try.
Well, and what do you think of it now you're in?
Feels absolutely delicious, like being in a washing machine. This feeling of being pummeled all over by little hammers, is that part of the treatment?
Well, that really is the best part of the treatment. It's the massage effect.
I haven't got rheumatics, and I imagine quite a lot of people might come just because it feels nice, do they?
Even in those early days, we saw the need for news analysis and news in depth. When the Notting Hill race riots brought a real risk of racial conflict in this country, we did a special program with 2 reporters looking at the problem.
The purpose of this report is to dig a little deeper into those grievances. To do this, I teamed up with Ernest Eitel, a West Indian cricket commentator and journalist who's lived in this country for 21 years. Eitel and I came down to Notting Hill together. He interviewed white people, and I interviewed colored people.
Well, now, how long have you been living here?
17 years.
Mm-hmm. Have you had any trouble from colored people living in this district?
Well, yeah, in a way, you know, you might be walking on your own along the road and they tell you to get off the pavement now, you know.
Were you attacked last week?
I was attacked.
What happened?
Well, I was away to pictures. On my return, I found that my house and the windows has been smashed to pieces.
This year, Parliament went on the air, not only at home, but to foreign viewers through Eurovision.
Eurovision isn't new, but still being used only for special events, like this first televising of the state opening of Parliament. As a forum for a daily swap of TV news between European countries, Eurovision was to get going only next year, in 1959. But it was a start, the herald of a communications explosion to come, in which over 1,500 Eurovision stories would pass through British TV newsrooms each year.
My lords and members of the House of Commons, today, for the first time, this ceremony is being watched not only by those who are present in this chamber, but by many millions of my subjects.
But Eurovision is two-way traffic. And when the new Pope was crowned, Italian television cameras in St. Peter's, Rome, brought these pictures to sets in England.
1962, foretaste of the 120 communication satellites that would later straddle the world. Telstar brings the first TV picture across the Atlantic.
It's a face. It is a face. Badly fiddling with the knob, trying to hold it, just like we would have held. But this is a face. Bouncing around, but you can see absolutely clearly this is a man sitting behind a desk. This is the first television picture to come across the Atlantic.
By the mid-1960s, the film was pouring in, not only from our own cameramen, but from abroad by Eurovision and by satellites. The bulletin was filled to bursting point. It took time to establish the idea of a half-hour news. People felt that it would not hold the audience, and it was not until 1967 that we got permission to try it. There was no clear idea as to what a half-hour news should be before we came on the air, and no one knew whether you could hold the audience on a story for 4 or 5 minutes. I was convinced that we could do this effectively with 2 newscasters. I was also strongly in favor of there being a commercial break.
London captain.
For two reasons. One, that if half an hour was too long for the viewer to concentrate, he got a breather. And secondly, we got a breather in production terms. We were, after all, doing this program from a tiny studio. The summer of 1967 was as hot as the summer of 1976, so much so that one politician who came in to be interviewed fainted in the studio. We were going to have 2 minutes in the middle when we could sort out the inevitable tangles which were bound to develop.
Plan for Europe, and with something for all pet lovers to think hard about, a contraceptive pill for dogs. So do join us in 2 minutes.
The first two programs were not a success. We fell between every possible stool that you could fall between. They were neither packed with news nor packed with analysis. On the third day, we had, by very good fortune, a splendid action story from Aden on that day of the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders reoccupying the crater. Alan Hart went in with them, and we ran that story at an unheard-of length in the bulletin for those days, I think of about 5 minutes in length.
I'm on patrol now with the 1st Battalion of the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, and it's going to be patrols like this that test just how firmly British troops have Crater in their control. Because if it isn't very firmly under control now, we can guarantee that we will be fired on and we will have grenades thrown at us.
The gamble of News at 10 paid off, and paid off quickly. I can remember very clearly sitting in my room reading the latest batch of highly critical comments from Fleet Street about the failure of this whole experiment, and under my desk came the viewing figures for the first week, and the News at 10 had been in the top 10 every night of the week. And it was clear that whatever others thought of it, the public liked it.
Wake up! And these, in fact, may be terrorists, because intelligence said that there was, in fact, a suspected band of terrorists hiding out inside this house.
1969. ITN has a new building and a royal visit. The Queen meets a new editor-in-chief, Nigel Ryan. When ITN first started, the studio was 7 floors above the newsroom. The lifts kept breaking down, and the staff had to sprint up the stairs to put the news on the air, often with only a few minutes to go. Now, ITN's new 9-story HQ is one of the most modern news centers in the world.
The opening of ITN House, and so that we may remember your visit today.
4 months before, ITN's coverage of the first man on the moon had been widely acclaimed as their best program yet. Now, Americans were on the moon again, and the Queen was in the ITN Space Studio.
Out to a toy shop in fact this morning in a hurry and buy these men and paint them up quickly because we were without any pictures at all from the moon today.
And we'd very much like you to have a model of the Apollo 12, which we thought perhaps
potential astronauts in this.
Well, I didn't even know what one. Certainly, we're really interested in it.
The move to the new premises has, of course, benefited us in every way. Colour would have been impossible under the old conditions of work. And the moment we'd moved, we looked back at Kingsway and wondered how on earth we could ever have operated from there in any way at all. The fact is that both the arrival of the new half-hour programme and the extra facilities and room, elbow room, in the new studios permitted us to make out of News at 10 a really wholly new kind of news programme in which it was possible not only to report snippets of news but to set them in context. It gave us indeed the capacity to introduce a whole new extra dimension into television news of explanation.
News at 10's first full year in operation, 1968, was a significant year in our development for several reasons. First of all, it was politically a remarkable year because it was the year of the enormous civil unrest, both here and in America, disturbances, even talk of revolution in certain West European capitals. And for television news, its significance was that we now had a vehicle in News at 10 with sufficient space to report at considerable length And these were remarkably vivid pictures of some sort of political expression which people were very concerned about. And at that time, it sparked off yet another discussion, whether television news played some part, possibly in causing these disturbances.
Of course, this debate has never ceased since television began, and we certainly talk about it a great deal in ITN. But there is a distinction to make here. There is no question that there are events which, if television didn't exist, could actually not have occurred. But that doesn't mean that such events should not be covered by television automatically. Were it not for television cameras, the world would never have seen Russian tanks rumbling into Czechoslovakia, and it was a courageous and very small group of Czechs who kept those pictures flowing to the world. Now, there's an example where television recorded a violence without which the free world would not have known what it now does know about what happens behind the Iron Curtain. At the same time, there's no question that many people consider that it was the coverage of Vietnam War shown on American screens, virtually live coverage, that forced President Johnson to abandon America's policy towards Vietnam. So there were two occasions where, unquestionably, television showed the world something that possibly altered very fundamentally their attitudes. Now, I wouldn't for a single moment say that in either of those cases any harm was done. A truth was revealed, and in being revealed, attitudes were altered.
In Belfast, nothing is simple. This fire broke out, apparently deliberately started.
The first problem that Ireland's posed, of course, is that it combines the challenge to order and authority that Vietnam posed for America, but it's happening within our transmission area, and therefore we have to be quadruply careful and sensitive about balance and impartiality and truthful presentation of events in Ireland.
Arrived. Fire was opened up just down the road. Over there, look, over there, over there.
Get the ambulance there! Stay where you are. Stay where you are. Stay where you are. Hold on. Stay where you are. First aid kit! Come on. First aid kit!
News of the Turkish seaborne invasion was broadcast over Turkish radio at 5 a.m.
One of the technical innovations brought in with the half-hour news was the recording of commentary on the spot.
People rushed from their homes for bunkers near the Turkish hospital in the Turkish quarter.
In the old days, the reporter went out with the film cameraman, sent the film back, sent a commentary probably written on the spot, and then the voice of the commentary was spoken in London. Nowadays, the commentary itself is actually recorded on the spot by the reporter, thus adding to the immediacy and the authenticity of the report. Very often, of course, this is done under most arduous conditions, such as this report by Michael Nicholson from Cyprus.
We waited for the Greek-controlled National Guard to begin firing on them with artillery.
But the result of all these extra efforts is that the half-hour news is itself a mosaic of miniature documentaries, each of them produced in the way a documentary is produced.
I've been here now since they landed from the DC-3s. Now about 500 of them in this position. They are moving towards the main road, the Kyrenia-Nicosia Road, and now 1.5 miles from Nicosia over there.
One graphic illustration of how television elbowed its way ahead of newspapers to become the prime source of information for 2/3 of the country was the coverage of the two recent Middle East wars. In 1967, during the Six-Day War, viewers were able, for the first time, thanks to the jet aeroplane, to see on their screens the events they'd read about in their newspapers that morning.
I don't know whether you read in the paper that they brought up...
In 1973, in the Yom Kippur War, they saw those same events 12 hours ahead of the newspapers, thanks to the invention of the satellite and the installation of a satellite station in Tel Aviv.
what you shoot today has to go to the Earth station today and appears on today's news. Now, because you're working so fast, you often have to grab anybody and make do with it. I remember the best example was one of ITN's scoops, one of its many scoops. And that was the first day of the war, of the Yom Kippur War, when Jerry Seymour went to the Golan and I went down into the Sinai. Now, looking back, what Jerry and I got didn't really amount to much. Jerry got a Phantom F4 flying overhead. He got a bit of artillery, a few ammunition trucks. I got even less. I got just a convoy of Israeli tanks and armored cars going across the Sinai.
Today, the strategy of the Israelis down in the Sinai has become clearer. According to their spokesman, military spokesman, the strategy of the Israelis has been to allow the Egyptians to cross the canal.
But they went wild here about it. I mean, they went absolutely berserk, and it was shown all over the world because it was the first pictures of that day's fighting back.
One new thing that we found when the portable outside broadcast unit was devised and became a real practical possibility for us to deploy in a flexible way that news must deploy its facilities was the enormous enhancement of both of quality and immediacy.
It'll be Cawley coming on this side. It actually looks like the winner. It's probably a good idea.
Certainly Wimbledon is an example of the moment we cease to cover it with film cameras, where it's quite a business to get the film back to the studios and often difficult to see the ball. The use of videotape as opposed to film has indeed transformed the coverage of sports such as football, which we can bring in late and where you can really see what's happening. And most of all, tennis, where the ball is small and it is essential to be able to see it.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Cue ground to end. Lose, caption, cue.
10 on the title.
Ambassador to the Irish Republic, Mr. Christopher Ewart-Biggs, has been killed
5,
by a landmine
4,
near Dublin.
And take
3,
one.
The civil servant, Miss Judith Cook, was also killed in the explosion 200 yards from the ambassador's official residence.
Roll BTL 3.
10,
The coven and the
9,
chauffeur,
8,
Mr. Christopher
7, 6,
are both in an
5,
intensive care unit
4,
in Dublin,
3,
suffering from
2,
From Dublin,
1.
There's no question that there are a huge number of new inventions on the way. The miniature, lightweight, outside broadcast camera, which can eventually produce more or less instantaneous picture from anywhere in the world that you want it. This is going to pose colossal editing problems. It's also going to provide magnificent opportunities for television newsmen.
So far, nobody has claimed responsibility, and the political wing of the official
Roll BTL
10, 9, 8.
It is also, as a result of that, going to come under colossal scrutiny and pressure. The one thing I do hope is that people will realize that television news is too important for anybody except television newsmen to be responsible for it.
Stand by OB. Stand by Julian, please.
In the Commons, Mr. Callaghan reported on the Dublin assassinations. The other party leaders joined him in expressing their condemnation of the murders. The whole House expressed their sympathy for the families of the victims. Our political editor, Julian Haviland, was in the Commons.
Take OB. Cue Julian.
There are times when members of Parliament, because there seems to be nothing they can do about the unending tale of murder in Ireland, attempt to...
Morning, Bradley. Thank you.
Chancellor Schmidt on the telex as an A item. And we also have left over from EVNO, from TVF, the interview with the French agricultural minister, I think, about...
I think if one had to make one distinction between the 1960s and the 1970s, it would be this. In the 1960s, in a sense, we were doing lots of things that hadn't been done before. We were finding the new technical means of bringing the stories from locations back into ITN. Well, now, without any drama, without any excitement, you can drum up a satellite to South America or South Africa or the Southeast Asia, and they are purely just carrier pigeons that no one takes much notice of anymore, other than the means of delivery of the story. So, though our actual outlet for News at 10, the half hour, which was born in 1967, remains the same, the actual volume of news stories available to us has increased by a factor of at least 5, I would say.
5? Well, we're going to have to keep a bit tight because we've only got 30 seconds. Okay, Jack.
So I'm afraid good stories do bite the dust, and frequently because of this. A news story that does not make that night's news is yesterday's congealed gravy the next day and never makes it again.
Specialists take charge of discussions on developments.
It is absolutely fundamental to everything that ITN does that all its presenters on the screen should not only be involved, but be seen to be involved in the news. Certainly, we introduce the practice of having newscasters who spend part of their time actually out in the field as reporters. I think the difference in concept between ourselves and the BBC has been in the past that they felt that somehow slightly stricter rules of impartiality should apply to the news reader, so that whatever he did, even when he wished a good morning, he did it in a way that didn't imply that he wished it had been a brighter morning, and that in some curious way the reporter could have more latitude. Now, we don't accept that distinction. We think that impartiality, fairness, balance apply to everybody. The modern newscaster needs not only star quality, but he also needs to have an immense technical knowledge, because in order to deliver, as he does sometimes, ad-lib news material, also to be able to interview people live from where he's sitting in the newscaster's chair, a practice that we introduced into ITN. He has to be a very good journalist.
He's in prison in Bonn. Bald and inconspicuous, sounds a bit like me. Right, I'll do that.
News at 10, which we hope will take the air smoothly between 10 and 10:30, has really been in the process of being fashioned and shaped throughout the day. The newscasters sit next to the production team. They actually throw ideas around. A happy phrase, a good headline, or a manner of treatment of a story may well arise from the good relationship, the sympathetic understanding between the newscasters and his production team.
Far more important than that, which is reported in Kenyan newspaper. A lot of our viewers don't know that.
When the newscaster takes the air to present the information that's written down in front of him, he has some idea of what the background is to that particular story and what's been left out and why things have been put in, because he's played a part in that judgment.
The Red Cross convoy was saluted with volleys. Yeah. Yeah.
With shots. So, and with volleys, and so it's saluted with shots.
So we take out volleys.
Yeah, we're saluted with shots.
Shots and volleys on car horns. Okay. Now tell me once more. We're saying Tel Al-Zata.
Tel Al-Zata.
Tel Al-Zata. Yeah. The time I've got through the Lebanon, I should be tired out.
Well, of course, nobody knows how much viewers can take of anything until they've tried it. The world was perfectly certain that viewers couldn't take half an hour, and they could. There are many television practitioners now convinced they could take an hour, and maybe they're right.
3. Roll Telecine 2, Q grams and in. Thank you, Reggie.
In Beirut, a second international Red Cross convoy has evacuated nearly 250 more seriously wounded from the Tel Al-Zata camp.
Roll VTR 4 and take camera 3.
Red Cross workers had to carry out the wounded...
ITN's position has to be a realistic one, that while there is only a single ITV channel, the prospects for securing any permanent major extensions to news in peak time, let alone an hour's news, cannot be good.
1 and Q, Andrew.
In the United States, it's now known that at least 77 people have died in the flood disaster in Big Thompson Canyon in Colorado. More than 500 people are still unaccounted for.
Our problem in ITN remains that the vastly increased volume of material coming in, all to be set in a context that conveys an intelligent picture of what's going on, puts great added pressure onto the editing process back at ITN House. At the same time, it makes it difficult to fit all the news in within the existing limits.
Seized in raids in and around London. Raids followed an investigation lasting several months into the so-called Triad gangs, an international Chinese crime syndicate.
Stand by telephone 2.
For the first time today in a one-day international between England and Australia.
On this
Soon it's 9 or
green
or something, yeah.
We're at Lord's just after breakfast to record their own part in a remarkable break with tradition.
When the BBC was putting out news and we weren't, we had a choice. Either we could have done a carbon copy of what the BBC were doing, or we could go our own way. And Aden Crawley very rightly decided that we should go our own way, and it's been our character to do that ever since. The day that we stop innovating, we might as well stop transmitting.
Scoreboard, which insisted on giving the score of the last man.
That's good, then.
Enid Bakewell, a small, powerful blonde,
30 on
gave Enid a
telephony.
solid start. And she went on to make 50.
Perhaps we ought to put her in the test match against those 20
on telephony.
2 next
The
on
job was
Reggie
finished
for the
appropriately
recap.
by
15
Mrs.
seconds.
Flint, and a large, menacing girl called Chris
1 minute to
Watman.
end a programme.
England had won by
10 on
8
telephony.
You wait after the sign-off for a bird knocking a ball.
5 on
Wait for
telephony,
this. She hits a ball for 6 or something.
2, 1.
And Q.
15 to end a
News
programme.
this
14,
Wednesday night,
13,
so a very
12,
good night to you.
11,
Take 2.
10,
You
9,
know a small, powerful blonde, Reggie.
7,
You?
Yes.
6,
Mary?
4,
Margaret?
3,
Eleanor?
2, 1, out.
Well, I suppose that was that one. I suppose that was that one.
The second half was rather sexy, I thought, didn't you?
Yes, well, some very good pictures. That Lebanon picture was good.
Lebanon was very good. I enjoyed the African thing. I enjoyed the triads. I admit I haven't heard of it.
Thank you.
You hadn't heard? I hadn't heard of it. It sounds like something by John Wyndham.
Even me, thanks.
Night all. Good night.
Night.
Good night.